Well, good morning, children. Today we are going to look at the parable of the foolish farmer. Now, Jesus told many parables while he was here on this earth. A parable is a story Jesus told that would be an earthly story. This means that the story would be about things that happen on this earth. So in the parable we're going to see today, we're going to look at a farmer. And the things that happened to the farmer, all the people that Jesus was talking to would have understood. But a parable is special because it has a spiritual or a heavenly meaning. This means it has a meaning that teaches us important lessons for our life and also for our soul. So the parable we're going to look at today is found in Luke chapter 12 and from verse 16. And you can find this on page 961 in your TPS Sunday School Bibles. So we're going to be looking at the parable of the foolish farmer. So our first point is the farmer's problem. So in this story Jesus told, we're introduced to a man called a rich man, and we know he was a farmer. Now this farmer, he had a lot of land, and he would grow crops on his land. And we're told that his land brought forth much fruit. That means it brought forth a lot of fruit and a lot of corn. So he would have made a lot of money from growing crops on his land and from selling it. And every year, in around autumn, he would have to plant his crops. And then in summer, the next summer, he would have to reap the crops, harvest the crops. And each year, he got a good harvest from his land. Well, this rich man, he had a problem, this farmer, because one year he had so many crops in the field ready to be harvested, so much fruit, that he realised he couldn't store it all. So once he had finished harvesting the food, the crops and the fruit, he would have to store it in a barn, and it would have to stay there for most of the year. Because harvest only comes at one point in the year, so he'd have to keep the food so that he could eat for the rest of the year. But this year he had got so much fruit and so many crops that he couldn't store it in his barn. Well, what was he going to do? He thought about this and thought about what he could do. He didn't want to leave the fruit in the field because then it would go to waste. So he wanted to harvest it. But what could he do once he had harvested all the fruit? Well, our second point is the farmer's solution. A solution just means the way the farmer was going to solve the problem. So the farmer came up with a solution. The farmer had an idea. He decided that if he pulled down the barns he had, he could build even bigger barns, and then he could store all of his fruits and all the crops that he grew. Well, this was a good idea, because the farmer needed more space for his crops, didn't he? And building bigger barns would allow him to store more crops. However, the farmer goes on to say, because he realised he got so many crops and so much fruit that he would never ever have to work again in his life, and he could retire at his age. So he said to himself, "Soul," that's the farmer talking to himself, "thou hast many goods laid up for many years." He had a lot of fruit ready to eat for the next few years. He had plenty of money. He didn't need to work. So he told himself that he was going to eat, drink, and be merry. He was going to retire, and he was going to enjoy his retirement and take life very easy, and he never wanted to work again. Now our third point is God speaks to the farmer. In all of this, we notice at no point did the farmer thank God for the fruit that God had provided. We know that when our food comes to us, that ultimately all our food comes from God. But this rich man, he thought he could rely on himself, and he had got a lot of fruit, but he had forgot to give thanks to God who had given it to him. So God comes and speaks to this rich man, and God says to him, calls him a fool. Now, if someone calls you a fool, it's not normally a very nice thing. They're calling you very, very silly. But when God calls someone a fool, it's very important, and it means that they have truly been a fool. If God calls you a fool, it's a very, very bad thing indeed. And it shows that you've done something very, very, very silly. Well, God called this farmer a fool, and God said to him, "Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee." God told the rich man that he was going to die that very night. He would die and his soul would have to appear before God, and he would be judged before God. And God says to the rich man, "Whose shall those things be which thou hast provided?" All the fruits that were in the rich man's barn, all the fruits that were still in the field, whose were they going to be once the rich man was dead? The rich man couldn't take them with him, and once he was dead, the fruits were useless for the rich man for the next few years in this life. But he had not thought about eternity and what would happen after he died. Well, we can be like that. We can be so worried about this life, so worried about everything, about our food, about our work, all these things, and we can completely forget that our life is only for a short time. Many of you are young, but in 100 years' time, very few of us will still be alive. And yet eternity is so much longer. And if we are trying to provide and get ourselves ready for this life, how much more important to be ready for eternity to come. This rich farmer was not ready for eternity, and that's why God called him a fool. Our fourth point is lessons from the story. In verse 24, Jesus talks about the ravens. He tells his disciples to look at the ravens. Now ravens, they're a big black bird that eat rotten flesh of animals that have died. But God told his disciples to look at the ravens. He says, the ravens don't sow, or this rich man had to sow all his crops, didn't he? The ravens don't reap or harvest, and the rich man had to do a harvest every single year. But God feeds the ravens. Even the ravens that don't sow the crops themselves, don't harvest the crops themselves, God still feeds them. All their food still comes from God. And Jesus tells his disciples that they're worth more than many fowls. And all of Jesus' followers are worth much, much more than many fowls, many birds, many ravens. All our things in our life, all our food, God has promised that if we seek him, he will provide them. In verse 29, Jesus says, "And seek not what ye shall eat, or what ye shall drink, neither be ye of doubtful mind." This rich man had spent so long working out what he was going to eat, and had been so worried about that. In verse 31, Jesus tells us what we should seek. He says, "But rather seek ye the kingdom of God." We should seek God's kingdom, seek to be one of God's people in his kingdom. And then there's a promise, "And all these things shall be added unto you." The food and the raiment, the clothing that was talked about in this chapter, all these things, if we seek God first, God will provide these things for us. So we shouldn't worry primarily about the things of this life, about our food, about our raiment, but we should seek first the kingdom of God and make sure we're in his kingdom. And if we are, then all these things will be added unto us.